My name is Colleen Fong. I teach in the Department of Ethnic Studies. This quarter I am teaching Intro to Asian American Studies as part of the ANA PC grant because CSU EB is an Asian Pacific Islander serving institution.
All right. Describe your evolution as a teacher of diversity and social justice. What has inspired you personally and professionally?
Well, I think my first inspiration was really my family. Both my parents were the upwardly mobile generation, and my mom was never able to go to college until after she gave birth to me. My dad was only able to go because he had served in the Second World War and benefited from the GI program. So I remember when I was 6 years old, my mom started going to what was then called a junior college in Sacramento. I think they're now called community colleges. And she was an art major and finished her bachelor's at some point, and then finally her master's a year after I received my bachelor's degree. So that was 1978. And she, it was really great having a mom who was in college because she was always studying, she was always learning. She would bring little gifts from the bookstore. I especially loved blue books to, have a little blue book to write in and to draw in. And, I remember some of the different classes that she took. I remember in particular a geology class where she had all her rock specimens in egg cartons that she had saved. And I just loved inspecting each one of those specimens and looking at it and handling it, and and also on occasion going to campus with her. So college was always a very positive part of my childhood. And it was something that was very familiar and very positive both. So I also think that the time in which I grew up definitely influenced my DSJ teaching or having a commitment to DSJ, as well as my mom being a college student. So, as I said, my mom started college, I think it was about 1961, and she was an art major. And so she was exposed to a lot of, not so much social justice issues, but I would say a lot of radical cultural change through her art classes. She was exposed to students who were experimenting with drugs and professors who were experimenting with all different types of relationships and different ways of teaching and so forth and so on. And although as a returning student or an older student, she did always gravitate toward other women who were similar in age, she was really fairly open to all the things she was exposed to on these college campuses. And she'd come home and tell me stories. And, some of them some of the things that happened she did judge, but other things she just thought were really kind of amusing, like when one of her art teachers came in and, went to the front of the classroom and before making any comments, pulls out a banana and peels the banana, takes a bite, and then passes it around to the rest of the class. And all the other students took a bite, but my mom just couldn't share that banana. Things as kind of innocuous as that to, really talking about some of the struggles that she felt women had in art school, or some of the women who were attached to male professors who were teaching in art school and maybe had children with them, but who had open relationships. And she saw a lot of that pain and jealousy and so forth. So this was all, eye-opening to me and made me start to think about maybe more just in interpersonal ways, what was happening to women and what challenges there were in building relationships and trying, not to have conventional monogamous relationships perhaps, but how complicated that was, especially for, kids, if kids were involved in that. I think another thing about the time period, having graduated from high school in 1973, I was part of a public high school in Sacramento that was bused. So while it was very racially diverse and class diverse, the students did not really interact. The students of different racial groups or different class groups did not really interact. And there were very few places where actually students of different races could come together and, work on projects together or maybe get to know each other. Those few places I wasn't involved in. I think student government was one. Another one was, it seemed a lot of the theater classes. I did take a lot of shop classes. To some extent, that did happen, but it was a high school that was sort of a difficult place to be racially. And I think every spring of the 3 years I was in high school, a quote unquote race riot would break out. So there would be, significant fighting over, I don't know what incidents would trigger it between the black students and the white students. School would close down, it'd be closed down for a few days. I was not really that politically tuned in to what was happening, but I just remember this was almost, a spring ritual that happened when the weather got warm and the kids were, out, students were out and mingling around during lunch and so forth and so on. Something would happen between the black and white students. It really wasn't until I got to community college, and I think, although I was not an EOP student, through my friends who were EOP students, that's where students of different races were able to come together and interact and get to know each other and work on projects together. So what really, or how I got here, how I got my first position here at Cal State East Bay was actually as a term-by-term lecturer to teach the first Asian American Studies course to be offered here in a very long time. And it was the same year that the Department of Ethnic Studies was established. So that was 1983-84. And I found the job announcement. Actually, a friend found the job announcement for me in the Oakland Tribune. And it was really funny because the announcement said that they were looking for someone who could teach, Intro to Asian American Studies, some other Asian American topics, and African civilization. And, I read African civilization and I thought, oh, they must mean African American civilization. And so I applied for the job and I was selected. And when I was assigned to teach that class, I found out it really was African civilization. And I had to contact a colleague that I knew at Oregon State who had taught that, and he was very, very helpful and told me what books he used, and I had to do a lot of reading and a lot of, just up-to-date research up until the time I walked into the classroom to deliver my lecture and so forth. I was just one step ahead of the students. But I think the point of this story is what brought me here partly was the chair of the department at the time, Michael Clark, is that, he had the faith in me that I could teach this class even though I didn't really have any background, but that I was willing to learn, I was willing to work hard. And I think that what he really modeled was that you know, when people are first starting out, they're not necessarily being assigned the classes that they have expertise in. But if they're willing to work really hard, it's important to give them a chance. And I think that's a real lesson for DSJ. If someone doesn't have experience for DSJ, that they are definitely committed and they want to make a difference, they want to learn, and they're willing to put in the hours, that sometimes you have to take a chance on that person. And that's how sort of the learning community or the DSJ committed community on this campus can grow. The other things that really brought me here that I really, really want to emphasize, because I think a lot of times people just focus on the hard work that they did and all the hours they put in and so forth. But I really had a lot of funding, and I benefited from a lot of programs, and I think that's really significant. And when I look back at my graduate school career and so forth, those things really made a difference for me, because there were a number of times where I was not happy with the graduate program I was in, and I really wanted to leave and do something else and not finish my degree. But having funding was significant, and I'll start with because I think these are structural things that any institution can do. So I went to the University of Oregon, and their policy in the sociology department, I think because it was predominantly a Marxist department at the time, is they used all the graduate fellowships that they received every year, rather than just awarding full fellowships to a handful of incoming first year graduate students. They were committed to breaking those up so every student had a little bit of funding. And so that was very significant, because it was very democratic. Everyone got to be a TA and got that experience from the very first quarter they started. Everyone got a little bit of funding. For some people, it was very hard to live off of that, the very, very small stipend. But for others, it was, it was workable. It was workable for me because I was able to get some other funding. But most importantly, if you were a graduate teaching fellow, you received a tuition waiver. And so that meant financially you weren't having to take out a lot of loans. You could just pay every quarter that you enrolled fees rather than actual tuition. And so I think this is what really made it possible for a lot of students. They only admitted 12 students each year, but made it possible for those 12 students to, to sort of sustain them financially and to make it through maybe at least those first 2 years of the doctoral program. The end of the first 2 years, usually most people were able to finish essentially their master's degrees. And so that was very significant. I also received the American Sociological Association minority fellowships, and those helped a great deal. And then finally, when I became a lecturer here at what was then Cal State Hayward, the CSU started what was called a forgivable doctoral loan program that I also applied for and received. So that meant when I finally finished my PhD and did take a tenure track job here, all the loans that I had taken out through that program were forgiven because I had decided to teach at the CSU. So I just can't overemphasize the importance of these financial types of programs in helping people finish, get through, because it's a very, very long process to finish a doctorate often. So although I was a lecturer here and I really liked teaching on this campus, once I finished my doctorate, I did apply for other jobs elsewhere, and it was really sort of interesting for me at that time to make decisions about whether I was going to apply for ethnic studies jobs or sociology jobs. Sociology is my discipline. As you know, ethnic studies is interdisciplinary. And it really sort of came down to, where I wanted to situate myself and also think a lot about who my colleagues would be. And I sort of boiled it down to, in sociology, I would be in my home discipline, but I sort of felt like if I were in a sociology department, I risked putting myself back in the same position where I was in graduate school, where I felt really sort of like a quote unquote racial minority, in that the department was predominantly white, and it was a real struggle for me at each step of the way to try and educate my colleagues about why race was important, or why having this perspective was important, or why their perspectives did not take race into account. I think at that point in most sociology departments, gender was not so much of an issue. It certainly wasn't that much of an issue in my graduate department, because I specifically chose to go to University of Oregon because they actually had 5 women on the faculty at that time. That was considered a fairly high proportion. That's one reason why I chose to go there. But as soon as I got to Oregon, I realized that the feminism that these 5 faculty women, all white women, were teaching didn't make sense to me. And that's when I sort of had to shift to looking at race and understanding racial differences within the women's movement, and how it wasn't just that the white mainstream movement or movements were not addressing the issues of women of color. And this is something that I really had to work on and articulate on my campus. But they actually, it wasn't that they were just overlooking the issues and, simply this additive approach. Oh, we need to be more sensitive and we need to take on the issues of women of color. But the issues that women of color actually needed to work on were in many ways oppositional to what white women needed to work on. And that was a contradiction that I think the women's movement and the white female faculty couldn't wrap their heads around. They couldn't understand, for example, at least initially, that if you're going to focus on higher conviction rates for rapists because it's an issue that all women could get behind, what they weren't taking into account is African American women can't get behind that, because who has higher conviction rates of rape? Black men. So it was those kinds of things where I think that the white women really weren't willing to acknowledge their privilege, acknowledge how they had blind spots because of their privilege, in order to really reach out to women of color, to build a multiracial movement. They had to acknowledge those kinds of things and make those hard decisions about, how they would go forward, what they would fight for, what was their issue. So I knew that if I chose to apply to sociology departments, those would be the kinds of things that I would constantly having to be working against. I thought it would be sort of a repeat of my graduate school experiences. But then again, I thought, if I got a job in ethnic studies departments, what the issues for me there would be gendered issues. So, I kept those things in mind. Fortunately, I did apply for a position here at Cal State East Bay when they created it. And, we were so, I think I was so fortunate to be in an ethnic studies department from the inception, where there was gender equity, where there were 3 women here on the tenure track, and there were 3 men. For the most part, the men were, feminist men. For the most part. Not in all aspects, but I will say that being in this department has been a very positive experience as a woman, and I've also, enjoyed the collegiality where everybody sort of understands where we're coming from in terms of a racial analysis, racial inequality, and so forth and so on. So, in terms of successes and challenges with teaching DSJ, I think the challenges with DSJ, well, first of all, I should say being in an ethnic studies department, it seems like at least diversity is, everything that I teach has to do with diversity. I think what's been a little bit different is the social justice aspect. So, and what I mean by that, it's very easy to teach about racial diversity here and then bring in, issues of sexuality and so forth and so on. But how to translate that type of a curriculum to a social justice curriculum is difficult. What the feeling I get from many of my students is that their lives are so full, they are just struggling just to maintain their course load. Some students more than others. And so how do you turn students into activists? How do you ask them to take on one more thing? How do you embed that in a curriculum where students are coming from all over and, going from family to campus, take a few classes, leaving directly from campus to work, and then back to family, and so forth and so on. So I think that that's been a very difficult piece for me to fully incorporate, the social justice piece. I think what it's come down to for me is sort of finding a place, at least a starting place where all students, what's the common denominator? And so one thing that I have been able to look at is, just talking to students about how, in this post-industrial world in which we live, we are all consumers. And to be conscious consumers, to ask them what they consume, why they consume it, where is what they consume manufactured, why is it manufactured there, and just to be more conscious consumers. And I think that a lot of students have thought about this already, some have not, but it's a place to start for them. And it is, you can go here, not only talk about race and work and labor and employment issues and wage theft and so forth and so on, but you can also move into globalization. So for example, where are your clothes manufactured? I mean, we can do those kinds of exercises in class. Students can read about the types of lives that women had here in the United States decades ago as seamstresses and sewing women, and how those garment factories have gone offshore and what types of lives now women in Bangladesh have, and how many have lost their lives in factory fires and so forth and so on. So the social justice piece is difficult. I'm always looking for better ways that I can incorporate that and better ensure that students will be able to fulfill that recently adopted institutional learning objective on diversity and social justice. Why are students not flocking to become ethnic studies majors when they're so willing to come to ethnic studies as kind of an emotional home, or a place where they feel comfortable, or a place where they want to come in and talk to different faculty members, and during office hours, outside of office hours, and so forth and so on. So I think that has been a real challenge as well. How to, I think it has to do with a lack of legitimacy. And so that's an issue that has been um, sort of a place where I wish that I personally and my department can be a little bit more successful, particularly now because everything is numbers driven, how many majors you have. But in terms of success with teaching DSJ, I think um, what's been best for. I think some of the most successful DSJ experiences in courses take place in the classroom where students in GE courses are required to make oral presentations. So in some classes, I have them present on a ritual or tradition that's just a part of their lives. So no research required, and it doesn't have to be an ethnic tradition, but we're talking about students sharing something about their own cultures in the broadest sense of the term. And this is where students really sort of get to know one another regardless of race, where they might see some similarities or be exposed to something very different. Um, and let's see, what would be some examples? Well, some students talk about how they celebrate certain specific holidays. Some of them are ethnic holidays, and so that's always an informative thing. But they also discuss how, just even meeting, like one student met three friends for their various birthdays and how, it was all women, how they had created this together, how part of that tradition for the birthday celebration was going out to dinner, starting to just share different types of wine together. And this had nothing to do with this particular student being African American, but it just shows how, what we think about as culture is definitely not stagnant, but it is constantly evolving. And I sort of accompany these presentations with, mini lectures about how it's kind of dangerous to try and essentialize culture or a cultural practice because oftentimes what students talk about